Oh, are we Bluetoothed as well?
Yeah.
Hopefully.
We're telling your followers that your video is live.
I'm hoping they can hear us.
Oh, people are in.
Can you hear us? How do we know?
So we've got some waves coming in.
Have we? Oh, I guess that means...
Can you tell us if you can hear us?
Because we're...
Give us a thumbs up.
Yeah, someone give us a thumbs up, because we're absolute incompetence when it comes to Bluetooth.
Yeah. Awesome.
Awesome. Right.
God, 32 people already. This is going to be more than what we're used to, isn't it? We've only done little workshops of tech talks.
We'd never get them in the van, would we?
No.
It's like carpool karaoke, but with 32 people on board. Sing along now.
So we're amateurs at this. We're in the van because it's got better audio and less background noise in the workshop.
So, yeah, we've done a few tech talks in the past where we've sat down with people and gone through a few questions over the course of half an hour or an hour, just to kind of talk about suspension, geometry, bike history, just rambling talks really, and sometimes they're quite entertaining because I'm normally a few sheets to the wind after having a few glasses of shandy, but today we're stone cold sober, so it could be shit. But we have a collection of questions, all of which were excellent, which people sent in, and some of which were massively long. So we'll cut to the chase on the questions. Sam's going to ask the questions, I'm going to do the talking, and Sam will remind me if I'm waffling or talking shit. The turd emoji will do that as well if you want to do it. So I suppose let's go then.
Yeah, well let's start.
Yeah.
Some nice questions, some of which are pretty useful to know. Others will be a nice subject to shed some light on.
To start a waffle.
So why is 30% sag the general consensus?
Not sure it is really. It's the most popular. I mean, people talk about 25% sag, people talk about 30%, people talk about a third of the travel as sag, people talk about measuring sag sat down, people talk about measuring sag stood up, and all of these will give different measurements. So when we used to measure sag, rider sag, as an element of motorcycle suspension, and when you've got a lot of motorcycle weight and the rider position is more fixed, like on a road motorcycle, the sag is a really repeatable element. But when all of the weight on the bicycle is the rider, and the rider can move all the way forwards or all the way backwards, then the sag, it's not quite as repeatable and is not quite as relevant. So we tend not to use sag so much these days. We tend to go for dynamic ride heights that create the handling that we want from the bike that we're trying to set up and the rider that we're working with, and then work that against the travel usage. And that's another thing. If you've got a really, really linear system and you use a third of the travel as sag, then the following third of the travel is going to be really linear and you're going to use it a lot. If you use a third of the travel on a really progressive system, then you'll not use the next third of the travel so much. So it's kind of, you've got to make everything fit the bike and the rider. And Yeah, so we tend to not think so much in terms of sag anymore. We think in terms of dynamic ride height, which usually means you end up with a stiffer fork than the rear shock, just because most bikes need that help to try and get it to turn. And we tend to then set the rear spring so that we get the max travel out of the rear, and we tend not to worry about getting all of the travel out of the fork. Hopefully that covers some of that. First question.
Yeah, well done. Yeah, that generally covers what we think about when it comes to
Did I waffle
setting
too
up
much?
No,
No.
not yet. You're not warmed up enough yet. So motorbiking, that's something you do in your spare time, isn't it?
It is,
And
yeah.
few people know that. So someone's asked, what's your favourite motorbike at the moment, and what does motorbiking bring to your riding enjoyment that mountain biking doesn't?
Well, it brings the same thing. It's the same, but it's different. It's all about balancing on two wheels. It's delicious. You can train a chicken to drive a car, but you couldn't on a two-wheel.
That's going to be a good quote for the day.
Yeah. But it's the two-wheel thing. It's a freewheeling a two-wheel vehicle is just a delicious feeling, and that first freewheel as a 5-year-old or whenever you got your first bike, you never forget that. And every time you freewheel a bicycle, you get that feeling of freedom. And riding a motorcycle gives you something very similar. They're different things, but it's just about the two wheels. It is just about the two wheels. I just love them.
So, what's your favourite motorbike?
It's the one you've got at the moment, isn't it? So,
But you own 4.
it's the one I'm riding at the moment then. Whichever I'm riding at the moment. Actually bought quite an interesting one recently. Bought an electric one, an electric Motion, and that's been really good because it makes you realise how a petrol engine, you just get used to things a certain way, and it's the same as geometry on a bicycle, isn't it? You got used to it when it was shit, you get used to it when it's a bit better, and you get used to the way a petrol engine works, and then you realise that if you've got a throttle that gives you absolute maximum torque from zero and absolute control as you wind it on, you just do things differently.
Yeah.
Well,
we could do a whole talk on that.
Yeah, we could.
But yeah, thanks for sharing those.
Yeah.
So back to bikes.
Back to bicycles.
Is front centre the most important geometry measurement on a bike?
There is no single most important measurement on a bike because they all interrelate to each other. And to a certain extent, all the measurements are a little bit academic anyway, because as we've already touched on, and we've only done 2 little questions, the rider is a massive part of the bicycle and rider equation. So just measuring the bicycle doesn't give you the actual active unit, which is bike and rider. And pretty much all of the usual geometry measurements are pretty dry and academic. They don't really touch on contact points or rider position. So front center, it just describes the length of the frame, and it was a really useful measurement 10 years ago because most bicycles then were too short in that area between the bottom bracket and the head tube. There were quite a few bikes with nice low bottom brackets, quite a few bikes with long swing arms. There were quite a few bikes with reasonably slack head angles, but none that had a long front triangle. But more and more do now, so I'm not sure that is the key now. I think the key now is to try and get a balance with the rider. So there's almost no measurement that's going to give you that. It's more of a trial and error thing, and change things as you go. Most bikes have some kind of adjustment now, and that allows you to get a really good balance setup for almost any rider on quite a lot of bikes. But no, I would have said probably not.
Okay, that's fine. So this is quite an interesting one at the moment with the increase in bikes with this design. Is your thoughts on the resurgence of high pivot systems?
Well, the system's not the solution, if you like, and the system's not, if you like, the problem either. So there are lots of good elements about the high pivot design if it's done well. There are lots of good elements about a horse link if it's done well. There are lots of good elements about a VPP style thing if it's done well. There are a lot of good elements about a single swing arm, design if it's done well. There are good examples of all and bad examples of all. But the high pivot is quite interesting because it does some very basic engineering things to the rear wheel path and the length of the swing arm as it goes through its travel, some of which are really positive things. The negative that I see around that design that hasn't been addressed since, let's say, since the Brooklyn Machine Works TMX that I owned back in the late 90s. Lovely bike, super heavy, had a high, very forward pivot, but it had a transfer drive to take the drive from the left to the right, so you got no chain growth at all. But on most high pivot designs you get a lot of chain growth. Most high pivot designs now are using an idler system where it's either on or just slightly offset from the pivot, so you get the correct kind of chain torque, which is the top chain line. So you get the correct feel on the top chain line, but you get a huge amount of chain growth on the bottom chain line, which can also intrude on the feel. So I mean, it's possible. It would be possible to solve that. I don't see why they're not looping the lower chain line back up to an idler up near the other idler, so that you could have less chain growth. That would be a pretty simple solution. But there's no reason why there can't be a good design. They're certainly going really well in the downhill races the last couple of years, so might be down to the fact they've had a fast Frenchie on board too. So.
Could be. Cool. So, but to a more Geometron related question, what's the plan for the G1 over the next 1 to 3 years? Is there any changes you want to see, or what's the major change that would bring real change to a bike of ours?
Yeah, obviously we'd love to see a gearbox of some sort in our next model. Whether that's a realistic proposition from a company our size with our resources is a different matter. We've explored it, we've spent some time on it, we've spent some money on it, and it's a hard nut to crack. It's going to be a very expensive job, and one of the reasons that it's going to be very expensive is that once you step away from the standard system that we're currently using, let's say for instance the gearbox is going to be centered somewhere around the bottom bracket, so we're immediately getting rid of the bottom bracket as the heart of the bike. Let's say we're taking the rear derailleur off the rear wheel and the cassette off the rear wheel, so we're immediately stepping away from that hub width, and we don't need to stick with that axle width, and there's all so many standards that are settled on the current design of bicycle that as soon as you move that one thing to a gearbox, you might as well build the whole bicycle. And then you've gone from a bicycle style of manufacturer where bicycle manufacturers buy the frame and buy the components from the component suppliers built to certain standards so that they bolt on. You're going to a more motorcycle style of manufacture where you design the whole motorcycle as one complete unit, and you optimize the components to fit each other. I can't see that we're capable, or we certainly can't afford to do it yet, and I don't do the scratch cards.
That's
so we're
the
not
scope of the gearbox bike project.
Yeah.
In our opinion.
Yeah,
So-
it's big. You could just put a pinion gearbox in, but doesn't answer all the questions. It's not the solution really. The derailleur is actually really good, but it's just in the wrong place. That's the nub of it really. Honda did a really good job of it so many years ago, but we just don't.
So
we don't have
what's
the
your plan
resources.
for the G1 over the next 1 to 3 years?
We really like the way it is at the moment. If we can come up with something that will improve it, that will retrofit, then that's what we'll do. If we can come up with something that will improve it that doesn't retrofit, then that's a really big decision to make, because it has to be a big improvement to warrant essentially buying a whole new bike. At the moment, I don't see a big enough improvement that I would want to ride something different to my G1. It still does everything I need, so, and more. It's still more capable than I need. So at the moment, we're looking for improvement in areas other than the shape of the frame and the assembly of the frame at the moment. But rest assured, we won't be designing the next frame around a 2-litre water bottle. So keep hold of your backpacks,
Nice, good point.
fanny packs.
Right, so back to suspension. It's quite an interesting one these days because we see a lot of it. Everybody likes to bolt in upgrades to their forks, or they like to look for this model. But what are the pros and cons of coil forks, and why aren't they so prevalent as coil shocks?
I don't know is the simple answer, because coil shocks are heavier than air shocks. Coil forks are heavier than air forks. So weight is the driving factor for the bicycle industry. So I don't know why coil shocks have ended up being quite as popular in a weight-driven industry. But they have, and the coil forks haven't. And I think it's mostly down to the fact that the published weight of the fork would just be too much for the product managers to actually buy into it. So it's not going to get designed, which is why most of the coil systems are actually bolt-on aftermarket things from aftermarket companies. So yeah, that's if you like the basic reason. There's no design reason why you can't make a really good air shock and coil shock, and there's no design reason why you can't make a really good air fork and coil fork. Most coil forks don't have enough negative spring, and most air forks don't have enough negative spring. But the air forks are so easily configurable that it's actually really easy to make most of the air forks work really well at the initial touch, and that's the important bit of the fork travel. It's the initial touch. So it's having enough negative travel so that the wheel is supported on the negative spring when you lift the wheel into the air, and that allows it to move under no resistance whatsoever as soon as it touches the floor. That negative spring usually doesn't exist in a coil, but can usually be fashioned in some way, either by sticking the fork down or by over pressurizing a sealed negative chamber in an air fork. You can usually do a good job of it. And a useful thing on a lot of forks is actually just to reduce the pressure in the lowers. If you can build an air fork with the lowers collapsed, that's great. If you can't, then literally just hold them up full bottom out and shove a zip tie through, and reducing that volume of pressurized air in the lower and making it lower pressure as it extends makes that initial touch and the negative spring feel that much nicer as well. And you know, it just
costs nothing.
It costs nothing, and as does looking after your fork and making the O-rings well lubricated and making the dust seals well lubricated, making the bushes surface nice and well lubricated. All of those things cost nothing. But yeah, most of the coil forks don't have the negative spring adjustability, and in a single crown there's just not that much room for the coil. There's not a lot of room. It's quite a short space. So
on a single crown.
Yeah, on a single crown fork leg, you're literally running out of room for spring. So
yeah, that covers that nicely. So
Sweet.
this one's going to be quite entertaining. I quite like the idea of seeing you on both of these options here. So the question is geometry versus suspension. So would you prefer a 10-year-old old school full suspension bike, or a rigid bike with your chosen numbers?
Well, we can't unknow what we know. So imagining that I don't know how my bicycle rides and how the suspension on my current bicycle rides, and that I had a really nice handling, fully rigid bicycle, I just wouldn't ride it on the tracks I'm riding at the moment. I'd be riding it on a BMX track, pretty much. That's what I'd want to ride it on. If it was a rigid, I'd be riding it at the groomed jumps, I suppose, and groomed turns and groomed berms and stuff. I probably wouldn't be taking it down the natural, rooty, rocky stuff that I currently ride.
So if it was just down to riding over bumps, you'd choose some suspension.
But again, if I had to choose the 10-year-old bike, I probably wouldn't point it down the trails I currently point my bike down. I'd probably ride it on the trails I rode 10 years ago, which are a lot easier. You know, what we used to ride 10 years ago would be, you know, quite a boring ride now, I suppose. Most of us are riding much more gnarly natural tracks with much more difficult features, and riding the stuff that we rode 10 years ago probably wouldn't be as interesting. But at the same time, if we didn't know what we know now, I'd really enjoy riding both of those things, but in their place. I'd either be a BMXer on a really nice geometry rigid, or I'd enjoy riding the trails that I rode 10 years ago on the bike I owned 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But I can't go back unless I bang my head again and go back. So lose the last 10 years, which is possible.
Cool. Nice.
Sorry.
So we won't see you riding down a trail on a rigid rigid 62-degree head angle bike. No,
and if that was my option now, I would probably just buy a pair of trainers. If that literally was my option now, it'd be, you know, I'd jog. So
cool. Don't get nervous, but we've got 130 people watching. We wouldn't fit that many people in a room, would we?
We couldn't fit them in the carpool karaoke either, could we?
No, definitely not. Cool. So, what could be done for what could be done to reduce friction inside existing forks? So maybe put this as a home mechanic who can knock the lowers off their forks and maybe pull an air shaft out without too many specific tools.
Right. There's a lot you can do in a standard fork. The standard sliding surfaces are actually incredible if you don't weigh very much, but the more you weigh, the more side load you get on those sliding surfaces as you load them. So somebody that's 50 or 60 kilos, the fork will feel great for a long time, as long as you keep the dirt out and keep the lubrication flowing. Somebody that's twice that weight, 100, 105, 110 kilos, then in order to keep that fork feeling nice, you're going to have to work a lot harder on the sliding surfaces and the lubrication. And so for the home mechanic, we've already mentioned reducing the pressure in the lowers. There are a couple of little tips that you can do. If you've got the possibility to get your service centre to press new bushes in every year or every year or so, that's great, because it gives you a new surface for the stanchions to slide on every year or so. If you can't do that, then sometimes roughening the surface of the bushes, if they haven't got too loose, can give somewhere for the oil to sit, and that makes the bushes a lot less sticky. If you think of it as the bushes are acting like the brake pad in the brake system, and the stanchions are acting like the brake disc in the braking system, when everything's brand new, the brake disc flies through the brakes and it doesn't do much braking. It's sliding really smoothly. As they wear together, the brakes become really good and strong. That's the opposite of what we want with a sliding stanchion against the bushes. We want the bushes and the stanchion not to create a really good match. If they create a really good match, there's no room between those surfaces for lubrication. So by taking the bushes and putting some radial scratches in with a little bit of wet and dry paper, obviously you're going to clean it out really well afterwards. That's something that can make a really big difference to friction on a fork without spending anything. You can do that yourself, and it makes a big difference. So, and the way to know whether it's time to do a fork service, are you looking for another setting in your fork? And if you are, then just service it instead. Essentially, you can ride almost any fork damper and spring setting if there's no friction. As you start to struggle to look for a specific setting for a specific riding experience, then it probably tells you that you're experiencing stiction in the fork, because it's a more random thing and you're always chasing a setting instead of understanding exactly what you need to do. You're kind of going backwards and forwards looking for a setting. So if you find yourself in that situation, do yourself a favour, learn how to take the lowers off, take the seals out, give them a good clean, maybe even roughen the surface of the bushes, and put decent lubrication back in, build them with the pressure out the lowers, and away you go. Away you go.
That'll help, yeah,
but,
for sure.
Yeah. The theory though, I mean, there's a lot you could do if you were at the design process, but there's not much we can do really, because the design process is held up by the design limitation of the fork market, which is all done in cast magnesium, so it's not really, we're stuck with that fixed bushing design, so you just have to make the best of that bad job.
Cool. So this question might apply to you and others really. Is how do you like your rebound to be? Is a fast rebound which can recover quicker preferred?
Well, it's difficult to say one way or the other. You've got to make you've got to make the rebound balance the bike and rider and the situation. If you end up with a really fast rebound and tip yourself down a a really fast rebound in the rear and a really slow rebound in the front, tip yourself down a steep slope, you'll realise what the balance of the bike is about. You really need the rebound at the front to be lively so that it will recover back up to full height, and the rear probably a little slower so that it'll stay into its travel a little more instead of over pitching. So it's more about the balance of the bike than the actual speed. The design of most bicycle shock absorbers and cartridges really dictate that you have to run the rebound quicker, on the quicker side, let's say. In a fork cartridge, there's a check valve that opens with no resistance on the compression side, but on the rebound side of the main piston there are actual shims bolted, so they've got a flex. So in a sense, you're over travelling on compression and then resisting more on the rebound. So it's easy to go through the travel on compression and a lot harder to recover. So on those systems, you tend to have to run the rebound pretty quick in order for it to ride at a reasonable height. And you find a lot of people end up putting a lot of compression on, or a lot of volume spacers, or a lot of pressure in a fork to fight the fact that the rebound is set too slow. And when you set the rebound up so that it's quick enough to recover, you have to do less with the compression, you have to do less with the volume spacers and less with the pressure as well. But it's certainly the case that most current production bicycle forks do need to be run almost flat out fast to feel good. If you're riding in the wet, slow, technical stuff that's not too steep, you'll probably get away with a real slow setting. But it's the case that for most forks, to make it feel like it's supported, it's recovering enough, and it's not rattling you to death when you get up to speed, it's almost full fast.
How could you advise someone to like go out and set their rebound? Because most people, when they consider their rebound setup, it's when they get bucked on a jump. They don't go out on the trail and look for the balance of the bike and see how it's recovering. They just think, oh, I'm getting kicked on this kicker. I need to slow my rebound down. How can you suggest someone to?
I'd start. You start with the front, make the front work really nice, and then match the rear to it. And what you tend to find is that most of the common forks, whether it's the RockShox Stamper or the Fox Stamper, will be within a few clicks of full fast on the rebound and very light on the compression settings to give you a comfortable, supportive ride. Whereas most of the rear shocks will probably be a few clicks further in towards the middle on the rear. So a way to kind of get a feel for what the bike is doing on the rebound is if you throw all of your weight at the bike as you're riding along through the car park, and then leave your arms and legs stiff as you push the bike as hard as you can into the ground. Don't then absorb the rebound with your knees and your elbows as it comes back as if you're trying to stop on a trampoline, but just push and stay rigid, and then watch what happens with the bike. It should come back and hyperextend and then settle back down to the sag point. So it should, if you put a lot of energy into it, it should hyperextend back above the sag point and then settle back down. If it's doing more than one oscillation of that, hyperextend back down below the sag point, back up, then slow it down a little. If it's only just coming back up to the sag point and not hyperextending a little and then back down, then speed it up a little. Your setting is going to be probably within a click or two of that when you take it out to the trail, and then you can do that by bracketing. Try it a couple faster, try it a couple slower, and just see.
Awesome. Yeah.
Does that work?
Yeah. Hopefully
I
someone can
don't-
take that out onto
I
the
don't
trail.
know. Do we see any turd emojis yet? Oh, well, am I
I'm
talking
not sure.
shit?
Yeah. Yeah.
Some comments have come in, but we'll have a look at them later on and do a bit
Yeah,
of
I
a
think-
live
Yeah,
live Q&A, and
we've
we'll
still got a
figure
few,
out
haven't we?
We'll figure out how to do that. So we'll just work off the questions that were submitted. This one,
Yep.
your best pre-ride drink before shredding downhill on your G1.
Well, obviously, if I was going to get paid several tens of thousands of pounds to wear the lid, I'd be on Red Bull, wouldn't I? But I don't have enough teeth left to risk the sugary drink, so it'd probably just be an espresso. That's what I'd have. I'd have a nice espresso, real rich, frothy head. Oh, yeah, that's nice. That's what I do. But it's more about the post-ride drink, not the pre-ride drink. The post-ride drink going to be a couple of glasses of red. Always for me.
Nice. Yeah.
Yep.
I'll finish a good run.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So this one could be, down to various setups, but bars rolled forward for better elbow position or rolled backwards for alignment with the steering axis.
Well, that's again, it depends, as we've said throughout this talk, on the rider and the type of riding that the rider's doing. So, as a for instance, if I'm riding my 175 travel bike and I'm actually pedaling it up and I'm actually pedaling it along the flat and I'm looking for speed through the flat turns and I'm descending, then my bar roll is going to be forward of the compromise if it was only for the downhill, because I'll be a lot more comfortable at the end of the day and I'll be faster through those flat turns and probably 90% of the downhills we do if I'm comfortable in a flatter position. But if all I'm doing is riding champery steep, then those bars are going to roll back because I'm going to be a lot further off the back of the bike and the elbow position is going to be in a very different position. So if I'm off the back of the bike, then the elbow position is still going to be good if the bars roll back. So it's kind of, there's no hard and fast. And the other thing about that, in terms of thinking about the bar roll in terms of your contact patch or your axle position, that also involves the stem and the angle and rise on the bar. All of it plays into each other, so that the bar roll that you get on one bar to get you to be comfortable with the hand in relation to the axle might be different on another one. So I tend to run a pretty flat bar because I can roll it forward and don't have much back sweep. I quite like a bar that's more like a trials motorcycle or a supermoto style bar where you've got almost a straight line in line with the forks. But that doesn't suit everyone, and that's the beauty of having a low rise bar. You can rotate it without moving the hands too far backwards and forwards. If you have a high rise bar, as you rotate it, your hands are moving a huge amount backwards and forwards, and you pretty much need to get yourself a different stem length if you're moving it backwards and forwards off the center line.
So what relation? So further more to your point of hand position, what does your hand position have in relation to the steering axis?
Well,
what does that do?
Well, you should try it. So if you roll the bar forward, you'll be tending to, as you load the bike in the beginning of the turn, you'll be tending to be driving more weight onto the front of the contact patch. So it will tend to carve or oversteer, to use a car term. It will tend to carve or oversteer more, whereas if you roll it back, it will tend to weight the middle or the back of the contact patch, which will tend to understeer or almost straighten out the curve, and you'll use more of the turn, or you'll have to turn later. So try it. that's what I'd say. You know, take a 4, 5, or a 3mm Allen key, whatever it is you need to adjust your handlebar roll and your bar lever position, and just literally do a few turns, go back, roll the bar the other direction, do a few turns, and see what it does to the steering and how it relates to certain types of turns. And that's how that's how you make the bike work for you. You just have to try it. I hardly ever finish a ride with the bike in the same condition that it went out. I'm always loosening handlebars as I'm climbing up, so I can reset lever angles, bars, and literally if you don't do that, you don't learn anything. You might as well have a go. It's there, it's cheap, and it's a way of making things handle.
Yeah,
rather than
good,
just using your balls.
Good advice. Yeah. Yeah, you might be able to make something easier.
Yeah.
And you don't know if it's possible if you don't try it.
Esatto.
Cool. So how can I make my sit position more comfortable while climbing?
Again, try it. You just got to try the limits and the range of movement. So it would be, everyone was taking the piss out of my forward nose saddle when we first started the Geometron project, 5, 6 years ago. It would be, nice looking bike, but
your seat's in a funny position.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, we came from road cycling for sure, and for decades and decades the correct saddle position has been pretty much flat. But the correct saddle position is to a certain extent dictated by the UCI. You're not allowed a saddle to be longer than a certain length. It's not allowed to be forward in space beyond a certain envelope in relation to the bottom bracket, and it's not allowed to be tilted forward in relation to the ground. And the reason for that, if you read the technical regulation from the UCI, is because it gives the rider a physiological advantage. So it's actually faster. But if the UCI aren't measuring your mountain bike, why wouldn't you do that? Now, the other thing to bear in mind is that you set it to be comfortable where you spend the most time sat on the saddle. So if you do a lot of flat road work, you set it for that. If you do a lot of steep fire road climbing or single track climbing, you set your saddle position in relation to your bars and cranks for that. And the only way to find out is to set those limits. And those limits are the fore and aft position of the saddle, the tilt of the saddle, the height of the saddle, and the position of your feet in relation to the saddle, whether you're clipped in or whether you're on flats. You can just move your feet or move the cleat, and that makes a big difference. If you think that the circle from the center of the bottom bracket to the fully extended saddle is in the range of 1400 millimeters, so the radius is your saddle height, if you like, then every degree on that circle is going to be in the range of sort of 10 to 12 millimeters. So moving your feet backwards and forwards in relation to your saddle is making a big difference on your seat angle too. So think of it, think of all of those possible adjustments, and don't overdo it. Most people tend to run the saddle way too high, so you end up engaging the calf muscles, which is bad for your riding, because then you have to try and teach your brain how to not use your calf muscles when you're riding, although you've used them all the way up the climb. If you can teach your brain to drop the heels while you're climbing, then you'll engage the hip rotators a lot more, which is, it feels good when you get onto technical terrain to be able to turn circles rather than pushing pistons. Fucking hell, I do waffle, didn't I? Did I just say fucking hell?
You did, yes.
We're going to get
it's only
cut
quarter
off.
past 4.
We're going to get cut off by the internet
We're going to get
police.
a fine now.
Yeah. Oh, shit.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that's comfortable climbing position, which is pretty important these
Yeah,
days. We're
and-
pedaling a lot more.
But essentially, if you tip your saddle forward, most people will find that it cuts off the blood to the cock less, essentially, and that's got to be a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
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 I think so.
Cool. Right. On that note, please discuss how flop is considered in various scenarios.
Blood flow
Right.
to the cock.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
Okay.
so yeah,
So-
please discuss
Okay,
how flop is
so-
considered in various scenarios.
So flop has had a really bad press from the mountain bike press because it's described all the time in a negative sense. Flop is never described as, oh, the bike had a really sweet flop steering as I turned into these tight uphill turns, or it's never described in a positive sense. It's always described in a negative sense. Yet flop is the desire of the bicycle to steer. The flop, the moving of the wheel from the centre line when you lean it off to the side, is what creates the steering impetus. Now, the slacker the head angle, the more the flop. The steeper the head angle kind of creates less flop as you tip it off the centre line, but it creates less steering the further you go off the centre line, whereas the slacker head angle, which flops when you're going really slowly, creates more steering when you lean it over, when you're going a little quicker, which means that you can more comfortably be into the lean angle of the bike without having to push the bike down in some strange yoga position with your elbows out, your knee pointing the other way, and you can kind of more comfortably push it in to the turn to feel the edge of the tyre, which is more stable. If the bike is upright, that's not stable. If it's on the side of the tyre, it's really stable. So the further over you can get, the more intuitive the steering becomes at speed. But of course, at low speed, you feel the flop. You can't design that away, really. That's something that you have to accept. If you're going to spend a lot of time at low speed, you buy the bike that suits that. If you want to go faster, you buy the bike with a head angle that suits that. So for me, flop disappears as you go faster anyway, because the self-centering effect of the rolling vehicle is now overtaking the flop effect of the bike. So it's once you get above walking pace, it's flop is steering. It's a good thing. Don't think of it as a negative thing.
Cool.
I don't know whether
This-
you were. I don't know whether the question was thinking of it as a negative thing or not. I don't know.
Well, just in
It was
various
just a thing.
scenarios. Yeah,
Yeah.
you said how some
Yeah.
people assess it on a climb. Yeah.
Yeah. Sweet.
Cool. So weight position on a DH bike. This is alluding to your days of strapping lead onto your bike and
Strap-ons.
your strap-on lead,
Right.
which is pretty interesting now because
Yeah.
most people have extra weight in their bikes. The e-bikers among you
Yeah.
will have probably noticed this on your bikes.
And more interestingly, a few years ago, the EWS bikes were obviously, when they first started from the 2013-2014 season, the EWS bikes were mostly trail bikes, which were very lightweight. And then the riders stopped using backpacks and started putting the weight that was in the backpack into the frame. So you ended up with a water bottle in the frame. Then you ended up with inner tubes and puncture repair kits strapped to the frame. Then you ended up with tool kits in bottom brackets or in head tubes or strapped in bags on the down tube. And then the riders went to coil shocks as well and put even more weight into that central sprung chassis, if you like. So yeah, more weight can be good. I certainly found that for me and for my riding style, the having the extra weight of the bike was not a detriment for me, because I spend a lot of time riding motorcycles as well, and a bicycle still feels super lightweight even if I've got 5 kilos of lead on. But what it does is it reduces, it increases the weight of the sprung mass in relation to the unsprung mass. Because if you remember, on a bicycle, the rider is not part of the mass. The rider is only part of the sprung mass progressively. So if you're at full extension, you cannot have weight on the hands and feet. It's just not there. If you're at full bottom out, your hands and feet can't be unweighted. So your weight in terms of the sprung weight of the chassis is fully dependent on how hard you're pushing the bike. So when you're rattling over the tops of bumps and you're at full extension, every single touch of the front wheel at 3-4 kilos of unsprung weight, which is the lowers, the brake and the wheel and the tyre, every single touch is going to send that 4 kilos straight up into the chassis. Now, the unsprung weight of the bike is not much different to that, so you'll get quite a lot of that coming through to the handlebars. So if you imagine taking that unsprung weight and plopping it onto the steerer tube or the handlebar or somewhere around the centre of the steering or up at the head tube, then for every bump of the front wheel that would rattle your hands, you reduce the input to your hands by the amount of weight that you put on in this space. So I used to do, when I was doing my lead experiments, I was doing two things. I was looking for a total weight, but I was looking for a place to put it as well. Now, I never thought other than that at the head tube for the hands and somewhere else on the frame. I never thought beyond that. But then I finally convinced Fabian Burrell to do a couple of tests with some weights added to a bike a few years ago. It was after he'd finished racing, and he's always been very obsessive about reducing the weight of his bike to race weight. But he did do the test, and he did it really well, and he was a lot more sensitive to the position of the weight up or down in the chassis than I was, and that's natural. He's a reckon better rider than I am and notices more stuff than me. But he noticed that he liked the extra weight on what I would call the steering axis. So from the rear axle up to the head tube. If the weight was at the bottom bracket, it was swinging outside this axis. If the weight was up at the top tube, it was outside this axis. If it was up at the head tube or halfway down the seat tube, as far as I remember from the notes that he gave me, the weight that was on the steering axis seemed to be more neutral, so the bike could still pivot under him so it wasn't affecting what he was feeling, what he was used to feeling, weight on feet and hands, because it was on the pivot. And you certainly see that with the MotoGP bikes. They try and get the weight centralized as much as possible onto that line, so that when they're changing direction, you're not trying to swing the weight in
over the top.
for a long way round. Whereas if it's on the steering axis, because that's what pivots, it's that head tube to rear axle, then you end up with a bike that handles more neutrally, lively.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
You didn't mention e-bikes, so that's
No,
even
I
better.
didn't. But I did. If anybody gets a chance to have a look at Praloop, I did lose a couple of lead weights that were jammed into my XTR bottom brackets. So if you see any while you're riding the track at Praloop, I'll have them back. They just fell out.
biohazard.
I'm a disaster. Sorry.
So this is another good topic. It's going to be crank length related. So in designing a mountain bike,
Yeah.
is bottom bracket height or bottom bracket drop limited by crank lengths? This question's coming from a person who's experimented and gotten used to shortened cranks,
Yeah.
and is starting to think that the 170mm crank is arbitrary.
In a way, it is arbitrary, isn't it? It's come from, again, it's come from road bikes, and that's what we just ended up with. It seemed like that used a good portion of the leg rotation to get a good amount of strength through. But if that's not your focus, if your focus is the downhills, then lowering the bottom bracket and shortening the crank might be a really good thing. I always used to run short cranks downhill racing and felt really good about that. Now, when I go to a shorter crank, I'm terrible. I've got used to a certain rhythm of pedalling, a certain circle size, and I always relate it to jogging in the woods off-road. When you're running off-road, you kind of subconsciously plan out the places where you're going to put your feet in advance. You kind of understand where you go subconsciously because you have a certain stride length. If all of a sudden you are forced to run a really different stride length, you would be making mistakes all over the place. And that's the kind of headspace I'm in when I put a shorter crank on now. I'm banging pedals a lot more when I run a shorter crank than when I run my normal crank length. But that said, if you've tested and that works for you, then it does work for you. That's the thing about bicycles. It's all about the rider, not so much what somebody tells you is correct. If it's correct for you, have the strength of your convictions. You've done it. But I keep banging my pedals now. If I go shorter than 170, unless I'm just freewheeling. Don't do enough uplift these days. Lockdown put pay to that.
Yeah, and you generally have the style where you don't pedal on a descent, where
No, that's
sometimes pedaling with a low bottom bracket.
Yeah.
With 170 cranks, you can clip your pedal if you're being a little bit careless with your cranks.
Oh yeah,
in
absolutely.
the heat of the moment, but
and that's something a lot of people do too much of. People pedal too much. You see people pedaling out of corners quite often, and you'll be sat behind them freewheeling going, well, they're not getting anywhere. What's the point of that? All you're doing is changing your relationship with the ground. Your heavy, light rhythm has been upset by your random circular rhythm. So you're heavy and light in all the wrong places. So sometimes it's better just to stop pedaling, look ahead and just let it drift. And if it feels slow, then it is slow. If you're coming out of corners and pedaling just to speed up, go back and try and come out of the corner with more speed. That's where it's coming from, not the pedaling.
Strava warriors.
Oh, I fucking killed myself with Strava this year, didn't I? No.
Yeah, cool. Right then. Any updates on the pending Mork 36?
Updates as in when it's going to be available.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. What are we doing with it? Is it
well,
ready?
it kind of is. We're doing a few out to customers at the moment. The only issue we've got at the moment is that we're only on the RC2 damper, so there'll be
so it's ready for people with a original RC2 cartridge. We've
Boost
got all the parts for
RC2,
that.
yeah, they can do that. But we do need to do a slightly different version for the other dampers. So, that'll be hopefully not too long. It's everything's been really difficult for the last year with lockdown, trying to get stuff done. But do you know what? It is what it is. There's worse things happen. So
Yeah, and moving on to dual crown.
Yeah.
Dual crown for non-DH applications. Do you rate it?
Absolutely love it. Have been cross-country riding on dual crown downhill bikes and dual crown trail bikes forever, and I love them. The difference between a single crown fork when you're really pushing hard and a dual crown is, you know, the steering accuracy, the feedback you've got, your line accuracy is so much better. Yeah, I'd say love it.
Yeah, there's few drawbacks to going dual crown compared to these longer travel single crown forks that we're seeing at the moment. Like
No, that's true actually, because you look at something like the Zebra, the 38, and the axle to crown on that's longer than a Boxer,
Yeah.
or even a full length 40. You know, you've got your axle to crown on a single crown 180 is now bigger than a full size dual crown fork. So
and you're still running out of space, you know, with the extra space of a dual crown leg at the top. We're gaining a lot more volume to play with.
and
The only drawback is you can't do bar spins anymore.
I never did them. Well, I've done them, but I never come
Unintentionally.
never come out the other side.
So
attached
no
to the
more
bike.
unintentional bar spins.
Yeah.
Cool. On that note, so someone wants to know when there's going to be a dual crown fork in EWS, but I know that you've done it.
Oh yeah,
You've done it.
Oh, I did it 2015, but I didn't win. In fact,
So who's likely to put a dual crown fork on their EWS bike? I don't know if anyone's got the bottle.
no, because they're being paid, and the bicycle companies, to be fair, are paying them to run bicycles that look like they produce. So that's not going to happen. But I've fallen out with the EWS anyway, so I don't care about whether we see a dual crown fork in EWS until we know who the other riders who had the adverse analytical findings at Les Ours were. I'm not interested, and until the riders who had the negative findings are banned for life, I'm not interested.
There we are. Yeah, that's
So-
fair enough.
Is that fair enough, or is
it is. Yeah,
You know,
we'll
accidental
see.
or otherwise, you know,
Yeah.
find another sport.
Yeah.
Crack on. See how
Right.
you get on in
So
athletics.
here's a saucy one.
Yeah.
Come on, you had to think about this one quite hard.
What is it?
From your friend Billy.
Oh, Billy Thackeray.
Favourite 80s power ballad?
Bonnie Tyler. Total Eclipse of the Heart. Every time. Just the gravelly voice gives me a sore throat thinking about it. Love it. And she's Welsh. There's lovely.
He won't ask you for a
A rendition, no. But but Billy, yes, Bonnie Tyler. I want to see that on the background of the next Billy Thackeray video
Awesome.
with E-powered digger chopping mountaintops off.
Right, cool. Let's try and go for some live Q&A. Let's see what comes up. I'm gonna have to rotate the camera a little bit, but if you've got a question, just drop it in. Let's see what we can answer for you.
Can't bloody say anything. Fazua! Need a dual crown with a coil. Yes, we do one day. I've got one. It's on my 300 EXC 2-stroke motorcycle. That's what you need, Fazua.
Gearbox on a G1. Let's just fire them out. We'll have a quick 10 minutes of.
Maybe one day. Maybe not so far in the future. Maybe years in the future. Who knows? Everything's so difficult at the moment with the lockdown. It's difficult to get anything made. But yeah. Is that Mac Ramsey? It is.
Yeah, Ramsey's been chirping up.
He is, and he's very chirpy.
So this is a common question. Can you elaborate on it for us? You've got, hi guys, Nikolai and Geometron. Is it one company?
No, we Geometron started buying weird geometry bikes from Nikolai over 5 years ago, because Nikolai were the only people who would weld us the bikes of the shape that we wanted, and be brave enough to warranty them. As it turned out, they went very well, and Nikolai pretty much absorbed the geometry into their range. So they essentially make the bike for us. The G1 was a bike that was designed by Geometron as Nikolai and Geometron's next model, but it's the only model we sell because it's the one we believe in. So Geometron is us in the UK, Nikolai is the bicycle welding company in Germany. But we're very close. It should be about cooperation, not cooperation. That's one for Sandy Plenty.
Yeah, quote Sandy recently. Sandy had a question for you.
Did he?
In your later years, will you be buying a 4-stroke?
Oh, I'll almost certainly be buying a 4-stroke, but it's not to do with age, buddy. You're still riding a 4-stroke, and you're a lot younger than me. You need to get pre-mixing, mate. If you ain't mixing gas, you ain't kicking ass.
Right then, let's see what else we got.
I don't know, I can't see those. My eyes are not... Oh, can't quit carton.
When a skin suit, when a Geometron skin suit's going to be available?
Oh, that would be cool, wouldn't it? When I can get back in one and not look like a flipping character out of Little Britain. That's not going to happen, is it? I think the next time I get down to 70 kilos, I'll have been buried by about 3 months. So.
Cool. We've got. Can you play Ace of Spades on the banjo?
No. Simple. I haven't tried it. I've got to buy a banjo. I'm going to have to buy a banjo. Oh, Billy Thackeray, you've got a banjo.
Here we go. Yeah. So
learn that and teach me.
Is the G1 too much bike for pedally trail centre or XC marathon type ride? And this is quite interesting.
No, it's a common question, but it comes down to if the bike is efficient and pedals well at 160 or 175 mil travel, then why would you limit yourself to 100 mil travel to achieve the same efficiency? And an inefficient 100 mil travel bike will pedal a lot worse than an efficient 175. So most of the 100 mil bikes end up with seat angles that come from road bikes, which, as we discussed, are described by the UCI. So you end up with a 73 to 74 degree seat angle. Ours is a lot steeper, so you could argue it's a much more efficient bike, and it will certainly be more efficient when going uphill than a slacker seat angle. If you're going up, if your seat angle is 3 degrees steeper, then you'll be in the same position on a 3 degrees climb.
Yeah,
you know, it's quite simple. The maths is simple. So put light wheels on the efficient heavy bike, and you will be going faster than you would be on the inefficient lightweight carbon XC bike.
So is there a sweet spot for weight? And there isn't in frame weight, but the wheel weight, the rotational.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to spin along quickly on fast XC trail, then lighter wheels with harder compound tyres with really thin sidewalls, so that the tyre can deform over every single tiny little ripple without slowing you down, without sending that energy straight back up at the chassis in the opposite direction. If the tyre is supple, light, hard compound, and allied to a light wheel, then it will roll fast. If you're setting the speed of the bike with the brakes, i.e. you're going down a hill and you're downhill racing, that's not important. you can have much heavier stuff. You're going to need to, otherwise it wouldn't survive. And that's the distinction I'd make when I'm doing more miles in the winter, let's say. I'll quite often stick the cross-country wheels on, and you do spin along at a very, very different speed, but without having to own a second bike, which is shit on the downhills.
Cool. So Ryan Dean testifies that the G1 is a mile muncher. Yes, keep on pedaling, dude.
Yeah, he did more in one day last year than I usually do in a week. I think it was a 135-kilometre ride, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Fair play to him.
Fair play.
Yeah.
Good work. So, Geometron e-bike, ever a thought?
No. No. Should I elaborate on e-bikes, or are people?
Well,
bored
yeah,
of it?
just have a run off what your thoughts are of late, and maybe what you've learnt, and where we're at.
So I've ridden quite a few e-bikes. I don't like them. I'll say that straight away. But I've ridden quite a lot of them, and I've ridden a lot of the generations of the motors. And although they are getting better, the premise of the whole e-bike, to my mind, is wrong, because it's replacing a normal bicycle. So I don't think they offer enough of a performance benefit yet to take me away from the kind of trails that I'm already riding on my normal mountain bike. And if they're not doing that, then I'll just be riding an assisted bike on my normal trails, getting kind of lazier. I might be going faster, I might work harder, I might not be lazier, but I will never be able to ride my normal bike on those trails again. So that would spoil the mountain bike for me. And has been shown to do so. It's really difficult to go back to riding up hills at the speed that you're used to riding on a normal bicycle when you've been used to going up on an e-bike. It's just not. You should ride different trails, but they're not good enough yet. I just think they're really shit motorbikes with a really shit throttle. The throttle is controlled by the pedaling and the electronic brain, and it's essentially rubbish. It would be as if you press the throttle on your car and it gave all the power straight away, and then as you press it further, the power tails off. So it's almost like a backwards throttle. And there's a lag on most of them, and they run on, which means that they should technically be classified as motorbikes. And I think most bikes already exist and they're pretty good. So unless you can come up with something better, I can imagine something better. I can imagine an e-bike that I'd want to ride that is allowing me to ride off-piste and is strong enough to survive riding off-piste, but it doesn't exist. So currently I ride my bicycle and my motorcycle, and the two things are separate. I don't ride my bicycle on the motorcycle tracks, I don't ride my motorcycle on the bicycle tracks. We're separate. They're separate things. It's like tennis and squash. They look similar, but they're separate things.
Cool. Something else we're really interested in, and it's quite exciting, but could you answer this question? Would non-fixed lower bushes in an MTB fork fix current stiction issues?
They probably would, but we won't know for a while, because all the current fork manufacturers are tapped out on supply, and they're all made in Taiwan, where they're really, really good at making very complex lightweight metal things. So they're very good at the castings for the lowers. No one else in the world could do that, really, certainly nowhere near the price. They're very good at making good surfaces on stanchions, internally and externally. No one else can get close to that either. So Taiwan deservedly own the market, but because they own the market and because they're currently working on 700 to 800 day lead times for supply to all the manufacturers, there is no compunction for them to change their designs to do anything better. So I wouldn't hold your breath. That change is going to come from somewhere else in the world. It's going to be very low volume manufacturer, not a high volume magnesium casting focused manufacturer.
Is there a fight with Steve Jones coming up against his e-bike praises?
Not unless we
No.
both get drunk down the boat again. Oh, that was interesting. Steve Jones's 40th in the boat. He did actually drop a chair over one of his mates' heads. So I wouldn't like to be that mate who gets the chair dropped over his head.
So-
But it could happen.
So, are you developing the next gen G1? If so, where are you taking it?
There's no point yet. We can't see the limitation for the G1 at the moment is not the chassis. It's not the frame, the aluminium frame and the rear suspension system, the kinematic. The limitation of the bike is not that. The limitation of the bike is things like the tyres and wheels that you can buy. The standards that tell us that we've got to use a 12mm rear axle over a 148 width on the rear, where all the weight is, and yet we've got a bigger axle over a shorter width on the front, where there's usually less weight. You know, these types of things. It's the rest of the bike needs to catch up. So I don't think the G1's not the weak part of the equation at the moment. I'd say wheels and tyres. We're being forced to ride really wide rims and really big tyres at the moment, and it's a frustration because you end up with more pressure than you need and a bigger tyre than you need, so it's less comfortable than it could be in order to stop it rolling off the rim. And having a wide rim doesn't stop the tyre rolling off the rim. Only the pressure can do that. Now, a narrow rim with a smallish tyre pulled round gives a really nice profile and a stable tyre, and a decent angle on where the sidewall meets the rim gives you some compliance there that you don't get if the tyre is coming straight down at the rim, and you're trying to push a straight line on the tyre wall. I don't think that the G1 frame is the weak bit at the moment. It's wheels and tyres.
So nothing
sorry.
in development yet. Sorry to disappoint you. What size configuration G1 are you both running at the moment?
I'm running an XL. Before I went to the XL, I was on the L and was happy on that. Then I went to the XL and was happy on that and faster. Then I went to the double XL and I was faster on that, but I was less happy on it. So I went back to the XL and started working on other things to try and get the speed that the double XL gave me. The double XL took away some of the dynamism that I had when I was the boss of the bike. The double XL, I was more of a passenger. And I think Sam's had a similar experience with medium and large, actually, so you should.
Yeah. So coming off large G15, and I had a knee injury, so I jumped on the medium G1, which at the time I couldn't load my back foot very effectively, so I was loading the middle of the bike quite well. So I didn't need as much. I wasn't moving around the bike as much in loading my pedals. So I got away with the smaller frame, and then
subsequently to that, once I recovered from the injury, I could move my heels. Ankle mobility was a really big help in moving around the bike and loading the bike. I moved to the large, which had 20mm longer front end and a longer chainstay. When I got more mobile and less injured and favouring less injuries, I was able to move around the bike a lot more comfortably, go in a bit faster and climb in more comfortably. And that's just an example of my journey and how, you know, different people need different bike setups for various reasons, and that's why not one size fits all.
And that's a really interesting thing, because what Sam was saying about the injury, we're all compromised in some way by the sports we've done over the years, or the lack of flexibility work that we've done over the years, or lack of strength work. So there'll always be a certain part of the bike setup that is compromised to meet the rider. But like we keep saying, the rider's the big part of the bike.
Yeah. So back to configuration. What configuration have you got? What's your favourite? I know you're
at the moment I'm pretty crocked. Well, not pretty crocked. I'm getting better. Everything's coming strong. But for the last few months, I've just been enjoying riding around on a sort of cross country 160 front end version of the G1. I've been running around on a Formula Fork with a set of lightweight 29 wheels and tyres that are just dangerous to ride in the mud. I've been enjoying that because that's the kind of trail that I've been riding on. But previous to that, my favourite setup was a very different thing. I was looking at a 170 dual crown Mork 36 fork, and a 175 setup at the rear end in a mullet configuration, with a nice fast rolling aggressor rear tyre, but a smaller carcass one, on the double down carcass, so it's decently strong. You can run it without too many problems on a 25mm rim, and then a Magic Mary super soft up front. You can run a super soft up front without too much rolling speed problems, because when you're actually rolling uphill, there's not that much weight on the front wheel anyway, and when you tip it down, you're glad of the super soft. So yeah, my favourite setup, I'd say rims 25mm or thinner, 2.4 to 2.3 carcass, double down, super grav, whatever you call it, style carcass of about 1,000 grams, 29 up front, 27.5 out back, mullet, and about 170, 175 travel, because the bike doesn't move around too much if you get the ride height correct. So, yeah.
So we've had a similar question a couple of times now. How about you changing the suspension oil weight for winter riding, or just opening a few clicks of both compression and rebound? So colder weather, what's that do to your suspension?
Yeah, you do notice it. You'll certainly notice it's less comfortable when you're riding hard pack bumps at 25 degrees in the summer, to ride in hard pack frozen bumps like we were last weekend. And there's not much you can do about it. You just have to open up the adjusters. It's viscosity, it's just, you just need to open up the holes a little bit when it gets thicker to flow the same amount of oil through at low speed. There's no other way of doing it. I wouldn't go to the trouble of changing the oil weight, because most Fork cartridges are already at 2.5 weight, which is like water anyway. So you just have to open up the adjusters.
Cool. So I think that'll probably do us, won't it, Chris? We've got to get on.
Well,
Getting towards the end of the day.
it'll do us. It's as if it'll do everyone else, and if we haven't bored everyone shitless.
Yeah,
Like,
we've still
did you
got
see
still
any-
got 122 on.
Did you see any turd emojis? didn't.
I
see.
didn't know. I saw some laughing face emojis, so you
Oh,
must
yeah.
be chatting some nonsense
Some shit.
or something funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this live video will probably be online for 24 hours on Instagram. We haven't figured out YouTube yet, so well, you've just got to watch
Yeah.
it before it goes. And if you need anything, give us a call.
And if Billy wants to teach me the chords to Ace of Spades on a banjo, I'm there.
Yeah,
I'm your man.
cool. Thanks for watching, guys.
Cheers. Thanks
Cheers.
a lot.
Bye.
Cheers. Yeah.